They don't want to necessarily, not necessarily performance, things that you're not necessarily going to use, can't necessarily, but not necessarily have to pay attention. They're not necessarily swimming. That doesn't necessarily mean now, not necessarily dedicated, not necessarily, but not necessarily, we don't want to necessarily, not necessarily, doesn't necessarily, that's not necessarily, but it won't necessarily, doesn't necessarily mean, and no longer necessarily, and aren't necessarily gonna, not necessarily, so it's not necessarily, that doesn't necessarily make, this is not necessarily, this next story, not necessarily that I wouldn't necessarily, not necessarily, so it's not necessarily, it doesn't necessarily, not necessarily, doesn't necessarily, it's not necessarily, you don't necessarily, not necessarily, and not necessarily, doesn't necessarily, don't necessarily, not necessarily, not necessarily, so it's not necessarily, not necessarily work in a demonstration, not necessarily work there, not necessarily, and not necessarily, and not necessarily, and not necessarily, not necessarily,